Dennis Stratton's time in Iron Maiden came to an end on November 1, 1980.
I got a call from Rod to come over to the office. I drove over there, and as I walked in, Steve was already there, sitting in a chair opposite. I shook hands, sat down, and Rod said, "I've got some points to make," and he went through all the stuff again about how he wasn't keen on me not travelling with the band and not liking the music I was listening to. It was like, "I told you, you've got to be 100% into this band or it won't work." I said, "I am into it. I'm 150% into it." By then, though, Steve and Rod's minds were made up.
And who should replace him but one Adrian Smith from Urchin, the band Dave Murray had left in favour of Iron Maiden years earlier. But it wasn't as easy a decision for Smith as it was for Murray. As Rod Smallwood told journalist Mick Wall years later,
"Decisiveness is Adrian's middle name. Even if you go out for a meal with Adrian, you'll be on the cheese and biscuits before he's even decided on his starter."
But Smith came to make a decision that he would not regret, and he joined Iron Maiden, an outcome that was set in motion years earlier, when Smith was just 14, watching the excitement that Dave Murray bringing his guitar to school used to cause.
He used to be surrounded by girls all day, and having the guitar, even then I could see it gave you some sort of edge. Girls noticed you, so I thought, right, well, I can do that.
Adrian Smith's virtuosic playing and songwriting contributions added a new dimension to Iron Maiden's sound, elevating their music to even greater heights. He was, after all, the guitarist Steve Harris had always wanted in the band alongside Dave Murray, but was never available as he had been committed to Urchin, which had since disbanded. Maiden kicked off 1981 with the release of their sophomore album Killers, less than 10 months after their debut album. Bursting with raw energy and power, the album featured the band's live staple, Rothschild. The band embarked upon their first US tour, no doubt tasting more than just success on their travels, opening for none other than Judas Priest at the Aladdin in Las Vegas. Smith remembers,
Talk about from the sublime to the ridiculous. As you arrived in the hotel lobby, there were slot machines everywhere, and you were just surrounded by all this glitz. I think Wayne Newton was playing there that night. Then you got up to your room, and there's purple wallpaper and a gold bedspread. It was enough to give you a headache, honestly. But the show itself was a cracker. I couldn't believe how many kids were really into it and seemed to know the songs. I wasn't expecting that kind of reaction from the crowds on that tour.
the band didn't just taste American stages for the first time, but also the American charts. After 2 months of touring, Killers hit number 78 on the Billboard 200. It was a modest charting, but a motivating sign of things to come. Meanwhile, Judas Priest went into the studio in the exotic party destination Ibiza in Spain to record their follow-up to British Steel. Out on the town one night in Ibiza, the band got into a brawl with some Germans at a swanky nightclub. Glenn Tipton picked up a trumpet and started playing it, much to the dismay of clubgoers. Back on their home turf, producer Tom Alom would be fed beer and cigarette butts through the trumpet, drink it all down, and continue on with his rendition of When the Saints Go Marching In. The resulting album, Point of Entry, received mixed reviews, being deemed a commercial album by many, and failed to reach the heights of British Steel. It still charted well in the US, but sold far fewer albums. Reflecting on whether there was pressure to release a more commercial-sounding album, Ian Hill had this to say.
There was so much pressure. We always had artistic license or artistic rights where if we didn't want to do something, we didn't have to. But these people do know their business. If they come to us and say, listen, I don't think there's anything on here that's going to get you onto rock radio. How about trying this? We'll obviously listen and pay attention to that. It was only ever suggestions. That was the first album we recorded in Ibiza. There were lots of distractions, but I don't know about influences. We spent most of the time on the beach or in nightclubs or driving motorcycles.
While Priest had taken what most consider a misstep with Point of Entry, Iron Maiden were about to take a massive step up, but not before a significant personnel change rocked the band. Paul DiAnno, ever the wild boy, had gotten into the habit of staying out for days, and would subsequently wonder why his vocal cords wouldn't respond. It became so bad that Maiden had to cancel a string of shows in Germany. It was the last straw for Steve Harris. Things simply couldn't go on this way.
So we're sort of like, as the band gets more successful, maybe he'll be more into it. But if anything, the bigger we got, the worse he got. I don't know. Paul seemed very nervous at times about how big the band was getting, and sometimes he'd be really negative about things. He was into it, but he seemed to be on this weird trip, like it all seemed to be happening too quick for him. It was like he was a bit threatened to come off stage some nights and pretend to collapse unconscious. He was always fainting. I remember when we played the Nottingham Club, right in the early days, it was the usual thing. Done the gig, crowd going berserk, absolutely mental reactions, you know. So we're going to go back and do an encore, and Paul's fainted in the dressing room. I've never seen anyone faint so conveniently. He always managed to land on a chair or on a flight case, never flat on his face. And this time I went and slapped him. I was like, "Get up, you bastards." And he just opened his eyes and went, "You haven't got any sympathy for me, have you?" I was like, "No, I fucking haven't." Now get back on that stage.
The last straw was a gig in Milan, where the promoter had oversold the show and asked the band to perform a matinee. The band agreed, but DiAnno refused, saying he couldn't possibly do 2 shows. The fact was, he had immersed himself in the so-called rock star lifestyle and culture a little too heavily.
It's no secret. I was pretty out to lunch on that tour, I suppose. It wasn't just that I was snorting a bit of coke, though. I was just going for it non-stop, 24 hours a day, every day. I thought that's what you were supposed to do when you were in a big, successful rock band. But Maiden had become so big by then that the band had commitments piling up that went on for months, years. And I just couldn't see my way to the end of it. I knew I'd never last a whole tour. It was too much.
It was a nightmare, said Steve Harris.
It's just a nightmare, really, but because the band was breaking big, we didn't want to lose him, you know. We wanted to carry on as we were, but we thought the longer it goes on, the more we've got to risk. And that's when it was decided we had to make the change. We didn't have any pressure from anybody. They just went with what we did. So it was boss and Rod and fuck everyone else, you know. So we all had a meeting, band and Rod, and we said, look, it's going to have to change.
With DiAnno now gone, Iron Maiden had a gaping hole at the front of the stage, and the band managed to not only fill it, but fill it with someone who would go on to become a pilot, fencer, author, film director, and MTV presenter, and someone with an unmistakable voice, capable of challenging and even surpassing the soaring and piercing vocals of Rob Halford. Bruce Dickinson was born in Workshop, a small mining town in Nottinghamshire. Paul was his first name, but he preferred to be known as Bruce. He made a name for himself as the frontman for fellow new wave of British heavy metal band Samson. Maiden offered Dickinson an audition, despite already knowing that he was the man for the job, something that initially annoyed Dickinson a little.
Then he started singing, and we did Prowler's Sanctuary, running Friesen, Remember Tomorrow. Then we chucked in Murders in the Rue Morgue and a few other things as well. But I think we just knew straight away. Steve phoned up Rod and said, "Can we get a studio this afternoon?" Then he turned to me and said, "What do you feel about that?" He said, "Fuck it, let's go, mate."
In Dickinson, Harris had found his match. Here was someone that took his craft and his ambitions as seriously as Harris did, and it would show. The band returned to the studio, retaining the services of producer Martin Birch in London, who would go on to work with the band through to 1992. The arrival of Bruce Dickinson as frontman of Iron Maiden brought forth a new era of possibilities. With his exceptional vocal range, Bruce introduced a dynamic dimension to the band's sound. This significant change opened doors for Steve Harris as a songwriter and Martin Birch as a producer, paving the way for Maiden to explore ambitious and intricate compositions. The 8 tracks on the album showcased the band's growth and showcased their ability to create compelling and complex material. One of these 8 tracks, Run to the Hills, was released as the lead single in February of 1982, introducing Bruce's air raid siren screams to the world, accompanied by a wacky Wild West themed video. The single hit the UK Top 10 chart and would be followed by the release of Number of the Beast the following month. The album rocketed to number 1 with a bullet on the UK album chart, hitting number 8 on the distant shores of Australia and number 33 in the United States. It would go on to be certified triple platinum in Canada, double platinum in the UK, and platinum in the US and Australia. To date, the album has sold more than 20 million copies worldwide. Subsequent re-releases of the album, as recent as 2022, landed the album back in the top 40 across Europe and the UK, 40 years after its original release. And with innovative genre-transcending tracks like Invaders, Children of the Damned, The Prisoner, 22 Acacia Avenue, the title track, and the 7-minute ambitious and progressive epic about a man being sent to the gallows pole for his execution, Hallowed Be Thy Name, it was hardly a surprise that the album did as well as it did. It was simply perfect. But not everybody loved it. Social conservatives in the US accused the band of being Satanists, and public burnings of the band's catalogue were organized. Other religious groups refused to burn the records, not because they were rare zealots who liked the band, but because they thought the fumes from the vinyl would poison them in some way, theologically or toxicologically. Either way, they smashed the records with hammers instead. The band's US tour was subject to protests, with venues surrounded by religious activists handing out leaflets, and in one case, a 25-foot cross was carried by protesters. As Steve Harris puts it today,
it was mad. And they completely got the wrong end of the stick. They obviously hadn't read the lyrics. They just wanted to believe all that rubbish about us being Satanists.
The subsequent Beast on the Road tour would see the band play 184 shows throughout 1982, taking in the UK, Europe, the USA, and for the first time, Japan and Australia. The jewel in their tour's crown, headlining the 1982 Reading Festival. Still reeling from the underwhelming response to Point of Entry, and now the breakaway success of Iron Maiden, Judas Priest was also met by growing competition from American artists. While heavy metal was undisputably born in England, thanks to the heroics of bands like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath and Deep Purple, the United States was creating its own style of metal and producing numerous contenders. 1981 alone birthed bands that began to change the metal landscape, from Motley Crue on one end of the spectrum to Slayer and Metallica on the other. It was amidst this backdrop of self-doubt and growing competition that Judas Priest raced back into the studio at Ibiza. But it wasn't a professional clinical job by a band hell-bent on reclaiming its place in the sun. As Rob Halford remembers it,
how we got through that record, I don't know, we were dancing with death. I went into town every night getting absolutely fucking bladdered. Ian drove a rental car into the pond out the front of the studio at 4 o'clock in the morning, waking everybody up.
The band often spent the whole night partying, and work in the studio was sporadic, occurring sometime between waking up and hitting local clubs like Pacha. Tom Alom, the band's producer, was not immune to such debauchery.
I have vague memories of Tom going down the tube into a foam bath at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's well known after midnight things get a bit messy.
This was perhaps to be expected from a band who had 2 years earlier released a hit single called Living After Midnight. In fact, the band was so busy partying that they ran out of time in the studio and had to relocate to BJ Studios in Florida. It was there that the band put finishing touches on the album, an album that would feature the now classic You've Got Another Thing Coming.
When our record company said, we're going to release this as a single, we thought they were mad. We didn't think it was strong enough. It was picked up by radio, and they played the hell out of it. So suddenly you were having people hear it when they're driving to work, driving the kids to school, in the shops. It was everywhere. It was a song that broke us, not just in America, but around the world.
The album featured 3 other crowd favorites in Electric Eye, Screaming for Vengeance, and Devil's Child. Released on July 17, 1982, Screaming for Vengeance became Judas Priest's best-selling album. Peaking at number 11 on the UK charts within a week of release, the success of You've Got Another Thing Coming, hitting number 4 on the US mainstream rock chart, meant Screaming continued to climb the charts abroad. Within 3 months of release, Screaming for Vengeance hit number 17 on the US Billboard chart and was certified gold. It took British Steel 2 years to reach the same milestone. The album has subsequently gone on to be certified double platinum in the United States. In the decades that followed, next-generation metal bands such as Iced Earth, Sepultura, Stratovarius, Halloween, and As I Lay Dying would all record cover versions of tracks from this iconic album. Priest embarked upon their World Vengeance Tour, where they played a handful of shows alongside none other than Iron Maiden. Rob Halford reflects on standing by the stage watching Iron Maiden perform on that tour.
Man, these guys are going to be huge.
In the next episode of Battle of the Bands, Iron Maiden hit escape velocity. If you're enjoying Battle of the Bands, take a moment to like, share or subscribe wherever you listen to it. And if you'd like to follow along online, follow us on Twitter at BattleBandsPod. Until next time, keep those horns up.